We're always told the story of Bretton Woods ended neatly in 1944. A clean table in a grand New Hampshire hotel, diplomats shaking hands under soft lights, and the world's monetary system rebuilt from the ashes of war. A single, elegant agreement. But that's a fairy tale. That's not where the real story even begins. The truth starts long before the system collapsed, long before Richard Nixon interrupted your favorite TV show to announce the US was closing the gold window in 1971. It starts before the dollar became this unanchored, floating thing that no one could quite pin down. The real story begins in a locked room, with a secret deal buried so deep beneath the official record it was never meant to be found. This wasn't a formal clause or a treaty paragraph. It was a financial compromise that was never recorded in the official minutes, never repeated in press statements, and certainly never referenced in the history books you read in school. Go look at the archive photographs from that time. The negotiators, men like John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, look calm, professional, even victorious. They're smiling for the cameras, projecting an image of total confidence. But the real story isn't in the center of the frame. It's in the margins. It's in the missing signatures on certain documents, the heavily redacted diplomatic cables, the sudden, unexplained shifts in tone between early drafts and the final agreement. If you look closely, you can feel the tension. There, a hidden incentive that would eventually become the fundamental fault line of the entire post-war dollar system. You see, the other nations didn't agree to the Bretton Woods system because they trusted the United States. Not really. They agreed because they were terrified of something much, much worse. They feared a total global collapse, a return to the beggar thy neighbor chaos of the 1930s. They were haunted by the specter of gold scarcity, a world where there simply wasn't enough gold to go around, a world where creditors could never be repaid in anything real. The war had exhausted them, and they were desperate for stability, even a fragile one. Before Bretton Woods was even signed, there was a whisper circulating among the inner circle of central bankers, the men who had seen the world burn not once, but twice in their lifetimes. The whisper was simple, but world-changing. Gold won't be enough. They knew it. They understood that tying the entire global economy to a fixed amount of a shiny yellow metal was a recipe for disaster. There would be crises, imbalances, and eventually, the system would buckle under its own weight. That whisper evolved into a quiet, unwritten understanding, a gentleman's agreement. The mechanism they devised was simple, but incredibly dangerous. Publicly, they would guarantee exchange rate stability. The dollar would be as good as gold, and all other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. That was the promise sold to the world. But privately, they engineered flexibility directly into the structure. They built a hidden escape hatch, a back door that only a handful of them knew existed. Think about that. The entire system was built on a public promise of rigidity and a private understanding of its inevitable failure. I once found a note, scribbled in the margin of a draft by a British official, that was later erased. But under special lighting, you could just make it out. It read, "Convertibility must fail quietly, not publicly." Imagine reading that in the dim, dusty basement of an archive, the paper yellowed with age, the handwriting faded, but unmistakably fearful. This wasn't the language of optimism. It wasn't the sound of confident architects building a new world order. This was the sound of resignation disguised as clever policy design. So, what was this secret deal? It was an implicit pact between the United States and a select group of its key allies, primarily Great Britain. The understanding was this: when the system eventually cracked, and they knew it would, they wouldn't blame the fundamental design flaws. They wouldn't admit that it was built to fail. Instead, they would blame the moment. They would point the finger at external shocks and circumstances. They would blame rampant inflation, the costs of the Vietnam War, the aggressive French demands to convert their dollars into gold. They would blame anything and everything that sounded like a temporary crisis, rather than a pre-programmed self-destruct sequence. This is the part of the story that nobody ever tells you, and you were never supposed to know it. Not because it was illegal or treasonous, but because admitting it would expose the profound fragility of monetary power itself. It would reveal that the entire system was built on a foundation of managed expectations and, ultimately, a shared secret. Behind every confident institutional statement from the IMF or the World Bank, behind every central bank's reserve declaration, there was a quiet, nagging fear. What happens when public confidence finally disappears? The incredible thing is, they already knew the answer to that question back in 1944. They just buried it deep in the architecture of the agreement. They created a system that was designed to look strong, but bend under pressure, and to break in a way that could be explained away. If you stick with this story, you'll begin to understand something that most historians and economists never fully explain. Bretton Woods didn't collapse just because of Nixon's 1971 announcement. It didn't collapse just because of trade deficits or a run on us gold. Those were the symptoms, the final fever that broke the patient. The disease was encoded into its DNA from the very beginning. The collapse was the inevitable outcome of a decision made in secret, long before the public ever even heard the name Bretton Woods. A decision hidden in a single, devastating line of logic. Make the system rigid on paper, but flexible in reality. That was the secret deal. That was the handshake agreement in the locked room. And once you truly understand that, every financial crisis that followed, from the oil shocks of the 70s to the currency crises of the 90s and beyond, starts to make a completely different and much more unsettling kind of sense. The story of Bretton Woods is usually told like a Hollywood movie. It has a clear starting point, July 1944, at the Grand Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire. The rooms are cordoned off, and 730 delegates from 44 different nations have gathered. Their mission is monumental: rebuild the entire global monetary system after the devastation of World War II. The headlines you read today make it sound simple, almost like a straightforward business deal. The United States proposed a new system where the dollar would be the world's anchor currency, convertible to gold at a fixed price of $35 per ounce. The other nations, desperate for stability, supposedly just agreed. And that was that. But real history is never that clean, never that simple. The official story is just the tip of the iceberg. Long before the Bretton Woods system officially collapsed in the 1970s, there was an invisible negotiation happening in parallel. This wasn't happening in the main conference hall. It was taking place in side rooms, in smoke-filled lounges, and through private, handwritten notes passed discreetly between central bankers. These were the people who understood a crucial truth. The formal plan being debated on stage could never survive contact with the real world. If you look at the public record, you'll find official speeches filled with optimistic words like cooperation and stability, but buried beneath those polished speeches were unspoken fears, the same fears shared by everyone in the room. They knew that the world's gold stocks were finite. They knew that rebuilding Europe and Asia would require far more credit than the available gold could ever support. And they knew that global trade would demand flexibility long before any nation was ready to publicly admit it. All of these anxieties crystallized around one single question, a question so sensitive that no one dared say it into a microphone. What happens if convertibility fails? The seeds of that question were planted decades earlier, during the turbulent period between the two world wars. The real turning point was the collapse of the classical gold standard in 1931. That year, Great Britain, the financial superpower of its day, abandoned the gold standard in a desperate attempt to survive a period of crushing deflation. That single act, a quiet decision made in the middle of the night, without any public debate, fundamentally reshaped how an entire generation thought about money. It was definitive proof that even the strongest, most stable currency system could break. And it wouldn't break because of politics or war, but because of simple arithmetic. Gold reserves simply could not keep up with the global need for liquidity, especially when trade slowed down and capital started to flee across borders. So, when the delegates arrived in New Hampshire in 1944, they carried the memory of 1931 with them like a scar. They were determined to avoid another financial panic, another race to devalue currencies, another frantic scramble for physical gold. But the solution they designed contained a fundamental contradiction, one that most historians don't acknowledge. They created a rigid, fixed exchange rate system while privately expecting it to break eventually. This wasn't because they were ignorant or naive. It was a strategy. The official architecture of Bretton Woods was simple in its design, but incredibly elaborate in its consequences. The plan was that all member nations would peg their currencies to the U.S. dollar. In return, the United States promised to convert those dollars back into gold on demand at the fixed price of $35 an ounce. On paper, this looked perfect. It established a stable anchor for global trade and investment, something the world desperately needed. But in reality, it created a massive structural imbalance. To finance reconstruction and global trade, the United States would have to supply an enormous amount of dollars to the rest of the world. As it did so, its own gold reserves would inevitably come under immense pressure. This dynamic was later given a famous name, the Triffin dilemma, named after the Belgian economist Robert Triffin, who described it in the 1960s. But the core logic was understood long before Triffin gave it a name. Internal memos from the U.S. Treasury, written years before the conference even took place, show that American advisors were already warning about this problem. They knew that if the United States became the world's primary supplier of liquidity, the number of dollars held abroad would eventually grow larger than the gold backing required to maintain convertibility. One particular memo, dated 1943, stated it almost prophetically. It said, "Liquidity will outrun metal." That single sentence, short, understated, and almost boring, contains the entire story of the next 30 years. It perfectly predicted the trajectory of the global financial system. So, to claim that the Bretton Woods system worked is only telling half the story. It did work for a while, because after two devastating world wars, the world needed something to believe in. It provided a powerful narrative of stability and American leadership, but beneath that narrative, a hidden mechanism was already operating from day one. In this hidden system, trust was quietly substituting for collateral. Governments didn't want to say it out loud, but everyone in those rooms understood that the system would become a pure dollar system long before anyone would be forced to publicly admit it. Gold was the symbol. It was the anchor that made the entire architecture seem credible and trustworthy to the public. But the architects themselves knew something else, something far more profound about the nature of money and confidence. They understood a two-part truth. First, when confidence in a system is strong, its convertibility will never be tested. And second, when confidence weakens, convertibility cannot be saved. Those two lines explain everything. They explain exactly how the Bretton Woods system came to be, and exactly why it would later unravel, changing the world we live in forever. Let's rewind to the late 1940s. On the surface, America's financial power looked absolute. Fort Knox and the New York Fed held nearly 70% of the entire world's official gold reserves. The dollar was, quite literally, as good as gold. But behind the closed doors of European central banks, a different conversation was happening. As early as 1947, bankers and economists were pointing out a fatal flaw. The Marshall Plan was pumping billions of dollars into a war-torn Europe to fuel reconstruction. This was essential for recovery, but every single one of those dollars was a claim check on America's gold. Think of it like a bank that keeps printing more and more checks while its vault of cash stays the same size. The more dollars that flowed out into the world, the more fragile the promise to redeem them for gold became. One of the most vocal critics was a brilliant and brutally honest French financial advisor named Jacques Rueff. He warned that the world had invented a system of deficits without tears. It was a poetic way of saying that the U.S. could spend far beyond its means, flooding the world with paper, without facing any immediate consequences. But Rueff saw this for what it was, a slow, steady erosion of the system's foundation. Every dollar sent abroad was a tiny crack forming in the base of the entire global financial structure. For a while, during the 1950s, this problem remained hidden. The post-war economic boom was in full swing. American productivity was soaring, and global trade was expanding. Optimism was the mood of the day. But if you ignored the headlines and looked at the ledgers, you'd see a different story unfolding. Quietly, discreetly, central banks around the world began to convert their dollars back into gold. This wasn't a panic. It was simple, cold accounting logic. If you held a piece of paper that promised you an ounce of gold for $35, and you had even a tiny suspicion that this promise might not hold forever, what would you do? You would cash in your claim. It was the sensible, prudent thing to do. So, through polite, diplomatic transactions, a steady stream of gold began to leave the United States. Country by country, the world's financial managers were voting with their vaults. They didn't believe the promise of convertibility would last. By the early 1960s, the cracks were no longer invisible. They were starting to show in public. To combat this, a group of central banks, including the U.S. and several European nations, formed something called the London Gold Pool. Their official mission was to work together to keep the price of gold stable at $35 an ounce by selling gold on the open market whenever the price started to rise. But the gold pool wasn't an act of confidence. It was an act of desperation. It was a collective effort to defend a price that its own members no longer truly believed in. They were spending their own gold reserves to maintain the illusion that the dollar was as good as gold. One Swiss memo from 1960, unearthed by historians, is incredibly revealing. It describes the London gold pool as a necessary illusion. Think about that phrase. An official document admitting that the very foundation of the global monetary system was an illusion, one they had to actively maintain. It's the closest we have to a written confession that the people in charge knew the system was a house of cards. The popular history often blames French President Charles de Gaulle for bringing down Bretton Woods. The story goes that in the late 1960s, he defiantly sent the French Navy across the Atlantic to collect France's gold. A bold move that exposed America's bluff. It's a great image, but it's just a headline. It's not the real mechanism of the collapse. De Gaulle's move was a symptom, not the cause. It was the dramatic final scene of a play whose ending had been written decades earlier. The real collapse began the moment the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed. There were two versions of the system. There was the public version, sold to the world as a permanent pillar of stability, where the dollar was forever convertible to gold. And then there was the private version, understood by the insiders, the economists, and the central bankers. They knew the system contained a fundamental contradiction that would eventually tear it apart. They weren't building a permanent structure, they were managing a controlled demolition. So when Nixon appeared on television on August 15, 1971, and announced he was temporarily suspending gold convertibility, he wasn't breaking the system. He was activating the escape hatch. He was pulling the ripcord that had been built into the parachute from the very beginning. The goal wasn't to preserve the peg. It was to preserve the power of the dollar and the stability of the American economy, even if it meant abandoning the promise that underpinned it. He was choosing to save the narrative by sacrificing the math. The evidence for this isn't in some single bombshell leak. There's no smoking gun memo that says, "Let's plan for the collapse." The evidence is far more subtle and far more damning. It's found in the archives, in the countless drafts of official documents, in the margins of meeting notes, and in the internal correspondence between the system's architects. When you trace the language they used over time, a clear pattern emerges. In public speeches and published articles, they wrote with soaring confidence about the permanence and strength of Bretton Woods. But in their private letters and confidential drafts, their language was cautious, filled with hedges, what-ifs, and discussions about contingencies. They wrote confidently for the public and cautiously for each other. This deep-seated contradiction is the real secret deal of Bretton Woods. The system wasn't designed to last. It was designed to work for as long as it could, concentrating financial power in the U.S., and then to break in a way that would be blamed on a crisis on speculators or on uncooperative foreign leaders on anyone but its own creators. And here's the most unsettling part of this entire story. Once you understand that the largest monetary system of the 20th century was not an accident but an architecture, with a planned obsolescence built right in, it forces you to look at everything differently. Every financial system has a breaking point. A quiet moment when stability flips into an irreversible slide. For the Bretton Woods system, that moment wasn't Nixon's famous speech in 1971. It happened a decade earlier, in a meeting most people have never even heard of. The year is 1960. We're inside the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. The topic is the gold and dollar crisis. If you read the official minutes, it's incredibly dense. All this technical talk about balance of payments and reserve adequacy. But buried in the handwritten notes, in the margins, there's a phrase that changes everything. It says, convertibility can no longer be guaranteed in actual practice. That wasn't a note of panic. It was a cold, hard recognition that the world had already crossed a threshold. It wasn't that the gold was disappearing. It was that the confidence was. And in a system built on the promise of converting paper to gold, once confidence evaporates, the collapse is just a matter of math. Here's the first twist that history books often miss. The people in charge saw the end coming long before the public did, and they quietly started preparing for it. How do we know? Because their actions don't make sense if you believe they were trying to save the system. Take the London gold pool, created in 1961. It is usually presented as this bold move to defend the fixed gold price of $35 an ounce. But if you look closer, it makes far more sense as a managed glide path toward an inevitable devaluation. The pool wasn't built to save Bretton Woods forever. It was designed to slow down the collapse, to control the burn, giving governments enough time to rewrite their stories and shuffle their assets. Central bankers weren't acting like optimists trying to stop a fire. They were acting like firefighters managing a controlled demolition. Every coordinated gold sale, every intervention to stabilize the price, was just a way to buy more time. Now for the second twist, which is even stranger. The collapse of Bretton Woods wasn't triggered by America's enemies. It was triggered by its allies. The famous example is France's Charles de Gaulle, who very publicly demanded that America trade its dollars for gold. But France was just the most visible part of a much bigger trend. If you dig into the diplomatic cables from the late 1960s, between countries like Switzerland, Germany, and Italy, a clear theme emerges. Allied nations no longer trusted America's promise to convert dollars to gold, not because they feared a sudden, dramatic default, but because they expected a controlled, deliberate exit. European central bankers used bureaucratic language, but their meaning was deadly serious. They essentially said, the current situation can't last. The United States will eventually choose its own domestic needs over its global promises. And they were right. When forced to choose between keeping its promise to the world and maintaining political stability at home, America chose home. It always would. This brings us to the third twist. The actual mechanism that ended the system. It wasn't a lack of gold. It was silence. The end didn't start with Nixon's speech. It began when central banks stopped asking for gold. That sounds completely backward, right? But it's the classic insider signal in a collapsing system. Around 1968, right after the London gold pool finally broke, you see a subtle change in the reports from foreign central banks. Instead of openly converting their dollars to gold, they started quietly piling up dollar claims, with no intention of ever cashing them in for bullion. Why? Because when the insiders stop testing a system, it's not because they suddenly trust it. It's because they know the test is meaningless. They knew the game was already over. Getting more gold was no longer the point. The new game was about positioning yourself for the world that came after gold. This is the part that feels like you're reading a declassified file. When you map the archival data against the policy moves, a hidden timeline becomes crystal clear. From 1960 to 1963, private doubts about convertibility start circulating in secret memos. From 1964 to 1968, we see stabilization programs like the gold pool, which, again, only makes sense if you know devaluation is coming. In 1968, the London gold pool fails. This is presented as a public crisis, but it's really just a signal to the insiders that the next phase is beginning. Then, in 1969, something fascinating happens. The IMF quietly introduces something called special drawing rights, or SDRs. This is step 4, and it's the key. And finally, in 1971, Nixon closes the gold window, making official what had been inevitable for years. Let's look closer at step 4, the creation of SDRs. Officially, They were described as a technical tool to improve global liquidity, a synthetic reserve asset. But if you read the internal IMF discussion minutes from that time, they called SDRs something else. They called them paper gold. That phrase wasn't an accident. It was almost theatrical. SDRs were the exit ramp. They were a parallel currency unit, designed from the ground up to function in a world where gold no longer could. The creation of SDRs is the smoking gun. It's the clearest evidence that global monetary authorities knew Bretton Woods was going to fracture, so they quietly built its replacement before the public even knew there was a problem. And here is the real twist, the one that changes how you see the entire financial history of the 20th century. Bretton Woods didn't collapse. It evolved, exactly as planned. The officials in charge didn't fail. They executed a brilliant, multi-decade strategy that was completely hidden from the public. The system was never about protecting gold convertibility forever. It was about using gold convertibility to smoothly transfer global power from a physical metal to something much more abstract: trust in the US dollar. Gold was never the destination. It was the disguise. The real project was the birth of the global dollar standard we live in today. Once you see that, the entire world of modern finance looks different. Nixon didn't break the system. He just pressed a button that was built into it from the very beginning. The architects of Bretton Woods weren't naive idealists trying to build a perfect world. They were pragmatic structural engineers. They designed a system that could abandon its own foundation without causing a global panic. That is the shocking truth hidden beneath every textbook summary. The collapse was not an accident. It was a feature coded into the system from day one. And the people who knew, they never said a word. What if I told you that everything you learned about the Bretton Woods system is missing the most important part? We're taught about gold convertibility and fixed exchange rates, but those were just the surface. In 1948, the United States was sitting on a mountain of it over 20,000 metric tons, more than 2/3 of all the official gold in the world. This gave the US dollar its ironclad credibility. But what happens next is what nobody talks about. That mountain started to shrink, and fast. By 1960, US gold reserves had fallen to around 17,000 tons. By 1965, they were down to 14,500 tons. And by the time President Nixon famously closed the gold window in 1971, the US had just over 8,000 tons left. That's a drop of more than 60%. Most people call this a run on gold, imagining a chaotic panic. But it wasn't a panic. It was a calculated, systemic migration. Think of it like a silent, orderly evacuation. Central banks around the world were following an unwritten rule: convert your dollars to gold now, while you still can, because soon enough, paper promises will be all that's left. Now, let's look at the second flow: the dollars themselves. While gold was flowing out of the US, dollars were flooding into the rest of the world. In 1947, foreign countries held less than 10 billion US dollars. A decade later, that number doubled to nearly 20 billion. By 1969, it had exploded to over 40 billion. Here's the hidden contradiction that was baked into the system from day one. More dollars were being printed and sent abroad than there was gold to back them up. Every dollar held by a foreign country was a potential claim on America's shrinking pile of gold. It was a simple math problem. You can't promise more gold than you actually have. And here's the kicker: the people running the system knew this. They weren't idiots. Internal US Treasury memos from the late 1940s show analysts running the numbers. They calculated that if global demand for dollars kept growing, the system would inevitably break. The world would eventually hold more paper claims on US gold than the US had gold to give. This wasn't a matter of economic theory. It was simple arithmetic. The collapse of gold convertibility wasn't an accident. It was a mathematical certainty. So, if they knew it was going to break, what did they do? This brings us to the third and most revealing flow: the composition of official reserves. This is where the true plan comes into focus. In 1950, around 70% of the world's reserves were held in physical gold. The rest was mainly U.S. dollars. But by 1970, just before the system officially ended, those numbers had completely flipped. Gold made up only about 35% of reserves, while foreign currencies, mostly dollars, made up over 60%. Why is this so important? Because it proves that central banks were intentionally moving away from gold and embracing the dollar. This wasn't a side effect of Bretton Woods. It was the hidden objective. Gold wasn't kicked out of the system. It was gracefully moved to the side. It became a symbol of confidence, a historical anchor, while the real engine of global finance shifted to credit and trust in the U.S. dollar. By the time Nixon made his announcement in 1971, the world was already operating on a de facto dollar standard. The gold window was just a story we were told, while behind the scenes, the very definition of money had changed. But how did they manage this transition so smoothly, without causing a global panic? They created clever mechanisms to control the process. Take the London Gold Pool, which ran from 1961 to 1968. The official story is that it was created to defend the price of gold at $35 an ounce. But that's only half the truth. If you look at the transaction records, you see a group of major central banks working together, selling gold in carefully coordinated amounts. For instance, in 1965 alone, they sold 1,000 metric tons of gold. They weren't trying to get rid of their gold. They were trying to manage market expectations. They were acting like a pressure valve, releasing steam slowly. Too much demand for gold at once would have blown up the system. But a steady, managed outflow allowed the world to gradually get used to holding dollars instead of gold. It was a controlled demolition, not a chaotic collapse. The final piece of the puzzle arrived quietly in 1969, 2 years before Nixon's speech. This was the year the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, created something called Special Drawing Rights, or SDRs. The official name was Supplementary International Reserve Assets, which sounds incredibly boring, but internally, they had a much more exciting nickname: paper gold. That's exactly what it was. The SDR was a brand new, synthetic reserve asset, created out of thin air, and backed by nothing but the collective agreement of the world's most powerful central banks. It was a direct, man-made replacement for physical metal. The creation of the SDR was the ultimate signal that the system had a built-in exit strategy. It was a lifeboat being built for a ship that everyone in charge knew was designed to sink. By 1972, the IMF had allocated over 9 billion SDRs. That might not sound like a huge number today, but back then, compared to the dwindling gold reserves being defended at just $35 an ounce, it was a massive intervention. It was like building a new runway right next to the old one, and quietly preparing to switch the plane's landing path without ever telling the passengers. The goal was always to move beyond the physical constraints of gold. Perhaps the most subtle but powerful clue is hidden in the language used in central bank communications. Before the system broke, internal memos often referred to reserves as claims on gold. This phrase implies a hard link, a physical reality. It means your paper is redeemable for metal. But over time, a new phrase started to appear: international liquidity. That change in language is everything. International liquidity doesn't mean a claim on gold. It means flexibility, access to credit, and trust in the system. One term belongs to the old world of physical metal. The other belongs to the new world of modern financial engineering. Around the 1960s, legal documents and reserve agreements started to change. Phrases like extraordinary circumstances, temporary suspension, and settlement via alternative assets began to appear. To the average person, these words mean nothing. But in the world of contracts, they are escape hatches. They create legal permission for a future where promises can be broken, without having to announce it beforehand. They were encoding a planned failure while keeping public confidence high. To understand why, you have to look at the incentives of the major players. The United States needed to run huge deficits. It had to rebuild its allies after the war, contain Soviet influence, and finance its global ambitions. This meant pumping dollars out into the world, which built both global demand for the currency and American political power. Meanwhile, Europe desperately needed those dollars for reconstruction, but they were also nervous. They couldn't rely on the U.S. being able to convert all those dollars back to gold forever. So, their strategy was simple. Hold on to dollars as long as they were good as gold, but be ready to pivot to something else once the time came. Then there's the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. It needed a global system that wouldn't shatter under pressure. This meant that, eventually, an asset other than gold had to become the world's primary reserve. A flexible, non-metallic asset was the only long-term solution. When you put these incentives together, they all point to one outcome: a controlled, managed transition away from a gold-backed system to a dollar-based system built on confidence. But a fast transition means a crisis. A slow transition means you get to control the story. Bretton Woods was designed to fail slowly. Let's look at the data. I'm going to give you 10 data points that, when put on a timeline, reveal this slow-motion exit in action. 1948. The U.S. holds over 20,000 metric tons of gold. It's the peak of its metallic power. 1950. Gold makes up about 70% of all global reserves. The system seems rock solid. 1958. Suddenly, the amount of dollars held by foreign countries hits 18 billion. For the first time, foreign dollar claims exceed the value of U.S. gold reserves. The cracks are showing. 1960. U.S. gold reserves have fallen by nearly 3,000 tons. The outflow is accelerating. 1961. The London Gold Pool is formed. This was a pact between the U.S. and several European central banks to cooperate in selling gold on the open market to keep the price fixed at $35 an ounce. It was a coordinated intervention to manage the problem. 1965. The gold pool is now selling massive amounts of gold, over 1,000 metric tons in a single year, just to hold the price steady. The pressure is immense. 1968. The London Gold Pool collapses. It's no longer possible to suppress the market price of gold. The dam has broken. 1969. The IMF introduces special drawing rights, or SDRs. This was literally nicknamed paper gold. It was the alternative reserve asset everyone knew they would eventually need. 1970. For the first time, foreign exchange reserves, mostly dollars, make up more than 60% of the global total. Gold is no longer the primary reserve asset in practice. 1971. The U.S. officially closes the gold window. Nixon makes his famous speech. But as you can see, this wasn't the beginning of the end. It was just the final, public confirmation of a transition that had been happening for over a decade. When you connect those dots, the pattern is undeniable. Bretton Woods wasn't broken by a crisis. It transitioned using a structural exit ramp built over nearly 30 years. Now, think about the geopolitical logic here. The United States used gold convertibility as an anchor to build trust and re-establish its financial power after the war. But once the world was hooked on dollars, once global trade ran on dollars, not because of gold, but because everyone else used dollars, that anchor was no longer needed. In fact, it was a constraint. So, the end of convertibility wasn't a threat to the U.S., it was liberation. Without the limitation of its gold supply, the United States could create and export credit in dollars almost without limit, funding its economy and foreign policy. The true birth of the global dollar system wasn't 1971. It was the period between 1968 and 1970, when central banks quietly gave up on gold and started hoarding dollars, because dollars were useful, liquid, and backed by the most powerful nation on earth. The mechanism that made all of this possible is something I call planned asymmetry. This means you build a system with two conflicting features: a rigid, simple story for the public, and a flexible, complex reality for the insiders. The public story of Bretton Woods was fixed exchange rates and gold convertibility. Simple, stable, trustworthy. But behind the scenes, the system was filled with contingency plans, SDRs, swap lines between central banks, and legal escape clauses. These were the tools that allowed the system to abandon its public promises without triggering a full-blown panic. That was the quiet genius of Bretton Woods. It was engineered to fail gracefully. The system wasn't built to preserve gold-backed money forever. It was built to create confidence-backed money. Gold was just the scaffolding. It helped build confidence in the dollar. Then, once the structure was strong enough, the scaffolding was removed, and confidence itself became the foundation. What looks like a sudden collapse from the outside looks like a carefully choreographed evolution from the inside. And this didn't stop in 1971. It accelerated. Without gold, liquidity could be manufactured at will. But the pattern was set, a stable public narrative masking a massive structural transition. Once you see this mechanism, the rest of modern financial history clicks into place. The 1973 oil crisis? That wasn't just a shock. It was a strategic repositioning of global dollar demand onto a new commodity. The 1985 Plaza Accord, where major nations agreed to devalue the dollar, not just a market correction, but a renegotiation of confidence between central banks. The 2008 financial crisis? It was a massive stress test of that confidence-based system. And the recurring dollar shortages we've seen in recent years? They are the natural result of an asymmetric system where everyone needs dollars, but only one country can create them. Every crisis is just another verse in the same song. Confidence replacing collateral, and narrative replacing metal. This may sound abstract, but it explains why central bank announcements today sound more like psychological guidance than financial accounting. They are managing belief. Bretton Woods didn't just shape our financial system, it shaped the very language of power. And here's the final, paradoxical proof. After 1971, gold didn't become irrelevant. It was reactivated, but as a shadow signal. Gold no longer backs money, but gold flows still track confidence in the money. That's why central banks are still quietly buying and moving physical gold, especially when geopolitical tensions are high. In 2022 and 2023, central banks bought more gold than in any year since 1967, just before the London gold pool collapsed. Over 1,000 metric tons in 2022 alone, with countries like China and Turkey leading the charge. This behavior perfectly mirrors what happened in the late 1960s. You try to convert your assets when confidence is weak. You accumulate hard assets when the narrative is shifting, and you do it all very, very quietly. The true mechanism of Bretton Woods isn't about gold or prices. It's about who controls the narrative of confidence, and when they decide to change its foundation. The architects of the system built something that was designed to outlive itself. They engineered an orderly failure, not a catastrophic collapse. In doing so, they created the blueprint for every modern monetary system we have today, a system built not on metal, but on belief, inertia, and legal flexibility. So when you hear that Bretton Woods collapsed, remember what you learned today. It didn't collapse at all. It transformed, exactly as planned, from a visible gold standard into an invisible dollar standard. And every financial crisis since is just an echo of that original, brilliant design. History books tell a simple story about Bretton Woods, a system born in 1944, stable for decades, then suddenly abandoned one August night in 1971. But that simple narrative is wrong. The truth is slower, quieter, and far more unsettling. Systems don't fall when they break. They fall when everyone stops pretending they still work. The architects of Bretton Woods understood this. They built a system that could fail in public while surviving in private. When President Nixon closed the gold window, news anchors called it a bold political move. In reality, it was the final, pre-planned step in a long process started nearly 30 years earlier. It was a controlled release of pressure, a pivot already written into the system's logic. The real warning here isn't historical, it's happening right now. We are living in a confidence-based monetary system that is behaving just like Bretton Woods did in its final decade. The official language still praises stability and cooperation, but beneath the surface, central banks and sovereign wealth funds are quietly repositioning themselves. Just look at the data. Since 2014, major non-Western central banks have been buying physical gold at a staggering rate, while also diversifying their foreign currency reserves into alternative settlement channels. In 2022, They purchased over 1,000 metric tons of gold, the highest amount since the late 1960s, right before the London gold pool collapsed. Nations don't act this way when they trust the system to continue. They act this way when they expect a fundamental shift. The pattern is repeating. A silent migration of assets happens long before the public narrative changes. The slow-motion exit that defined the end of Bretton Woods is happening again today. Only this time, the exit isn't from gold to dollars. It's an exit from a single dollar reserve system into multiple, parallel corridors of liquidity. The deeper warning isn't about gold or currency. It's about what happens when confidence is engineered to replace hard collateral. Confidence is elastic. It can stretch much further than gold ever could. But when it breaks, there's no automatic backstop. Gold has weight and scarcity. Confidence has psychology and political opportunity. You can expand confidence with speeches, swap lines, and emergency lending facilities. But none of those things create real collateral. They just create a temporary consensus that collateral isn't necessary for now, and that consensus feels just like stability. Up until the moment something challenges it. Every modern financial crisis since 1998 has revealed the same truth. Systems that run on confidence don't need to fail loudly with a big crash. They fail in quiet repricing events, in sudden liquidity vacuums, in the silent relocation of capital that happens long before the headlines catch up. Listen to the language of central bankers today. It's filled with phrases like flexibility, temporary mechanisms, extraordinary measures, and unconventional tools. This isn't improvisation. These phrases are the modern-day equivalents of the escape clauses built into the original Bretton Woods architecture. They create legal permission for the system to remain intact on paper while its underlying structure is completely transformed in reality. The real risk isn't a sudden collapse. It's a managed transition that hides the true incentive structure from the public. The architects of Bretton Woods left behind a blueprint, and today's monetary engineers are still using it. So, if you want to understand the future, stop asking, what will break the system? Instead, start asking, what has already begun to shift quietly? Before Bretton Woods collapsed, currency conversion patterns changed. Before the 1971 announcement, the composition of national reserves reversed. Before public confidence failed, central banks invented a new language to manage perceptions. Today's signals are different, but the pattern is eerily familiar. Gold accumulation outside the dollar system, new regional clearing agreements, and the rise of alternative reserve assets. These are not political statements. They are structural hedges, preparing for a future where confidence needs a new anchor. The final insight is simple, but it should stay with you. Monetary systems never truly end, they mutate. Bretton Woods didn't die in 1971. It just became invisible, transforming into a dollar network that no longer needed gold convertibility to function. The next mutation is already in motion. You can see it in the experiments with commodity-backed settlements, in the discussions around a BRICS currency, in the web of bilateral swap lines, and in the quiet accumulation of gold that rarely makes headlines, but always shows up in the data. If you ignore the surface-level politics and follow the structural necessities, you'll see the same logic returning: a rigid public narrative, a flexible hidden mechanism, and a planned asymmetry of information. When the next big shift comes, and it will look sudden to most people. But now, you know that suddenness is an illusion. The truth moves slowly, in silence, through reserve books, legal clauses, and settlement flows. It will not announce itself. It will not explain. It will only become visible when it's already too late to react. That is how power preserves itself. So watch the migration, not the proclamation. Follow the silent flows. And remember, markets don't move. They are moved. Systems don't break. They are abandoned. The story doesn't end here. The system is just changing its shape in the dark.